Here. So good morning. Where we're leaving off or where we're taking off from is where we left off last week. When we're discussing leases, right? Types of leases is the section that we are at in our book. And we're going to talk about, the type of property that is being leased and what makes sense for the type of lease, the three basic forms of lease payments, like a gross lease, a net lease, a percentage lease, and discuss some of these and how they work. So when we think about a gross lease, what is a gross lease?
The landlord pays for everything except you pay the rent.
Right.
So,
and water and electrical and phone and stuff like that, but they pay everything else.
Right.
Like your basic type of lease.
Yep. So, well, we hate to say basic because, it could be so many different ways. I mean, we're used to, yes, when it comes to a residential, most residential leases, right, are usually gross leases, right, where the tenant is going to pay a fixed amount, $900 a month, $1,300 a month, and some or all of the utility expenses, while the landlord is going to pay for the taxes, the insurance, the repairs, maintenance, and so forth. So example, I have a space available in Talent, Hartford Turnpike, if you want to look it up, right? The gentleman, he wants $1,300 a month for about 1,300 square feet, and it's a commercial lease, right? But he's actually paying for the heat, the hot water, the air conditioning, and the electricity. You just have to basically pay for your I take that back, not the electricity. You just have to pay for your electricity and your internet and your phone, right? But he's paying for the heat, the hot water, and the cooling, right?
That's a big expense.
Yeah, which is a huge opportunity for some people. But you see, that's the reason why we have to have these discussions too, is because when it comes to commercial leases, things sometimes will get very, very complicated, right? And the next one that we're going to discuss is what I think gets really complicated with people. So it's basically called a net lease. And some people will be like, oh, that's a triple net lease. So, that's a net lease. Oh yeah, I know what that is. Well, the point is, it's not an exact thing. There are combinations of all these different ones. So example, the basic of a net lease is that the tenant is not only is going to pay the rent, right? But they might pay all or some of the property expenses. Now, if you're not used to thinking about commercial leases, that might not make sense to you, right? But that's sometimes how it works. The tenant might have to pay most or some of the property expenses like hazard insurance, property taxes, CAM charges, and so forth, right? And so it depends on things. Like I have the example, I've told you about this gentleman that he owns an 8-unit commercial little strip plaza, right? Where they have a lawn, a barber shop, a cell phone store, a nail salon, a vape shop, a little convenience store, right? And he'll say, okay, well, every time there's a snowstorm, this guy's no joke, right? Every time there's a snowstorm, he has to pay about $200 for the plowing, right? So what does he do? Every time there's a snowstorm, he goes to each one of them. Okay, you owe me $25. And he'll tell me that he will stand there until they give him the $25. He'll show them the bill. He'll get the bill from the plow guy because he tells the guy, every time after you do it, you give me the bill right away. And then he goes in there and he says, look, here's the bill. It's about $200, whatever. You owe me $25. And he stands, and that's what he has in the lease, right? Or in some cases, sometimes it doesn't happen often, but there's sometimes where like all of a sudden taxes will go will increase dramatically, or property insurance will increase dramatically. And sometimes the landlords can or cannot or don't want to absorb that additional cost. So they might have it in their lease that the tenant is going to pay a certain percentage of the property insurance, right? So it just depends on a lot of different things. So who has questions about a net lease? Okay. Percentage lease. On the surface, people think this is crazy. You might be like, well, who would ever do that? But guess what? There's people all over the place, businesses all over that are doing this, right? A percentage lease is usually for what kind of businesses? Who knows?
Retail.
Retail. And what they do, they say, okay, here's the minimum fixed rental amount plus a percentage of the gross income, right? And of course, that's variable. It depends on a lot of different
This
things.
is huge in the restaurant business.
Oh, they use it in a restaurant too?
This is huge in the restaurant business. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
So
Absolutely.
where I've seen it mostly is kind of like malls, or where there's a more of a destination, like an outlet, like a bunch of stores, like almost like an outlet kind of situation, right? In fact, go
This
ahead.
is huge in restaurants only because usually if a restaurant's just starting off, they might make a deal with the owner, the lender, the landlord that says, I need a break for the first 6 months, in rent so I can start picking my name up, and they will work out a deal where it turns out to be a percentage lease so that it catches up in the rears and they get better. And then they'll stop it or they'll continue it depending on how much they want to spend.
Yep. So like I know this one gentleman that he wanted to open up a bakery, right? And they made like the little pastries, like these little French kinds of things, and it was a brand new business, and he wanted to open up in one of these, like more of a destination area, like people like, oh, let's go here for the day, let's go to Evergreen, let's go to this outlet, let's go to that outlet. So he was in one of these kind of like destination spaces, and they said, okay, well, in some cases they'll go up to 100 or even more, $100 per square foot. So think about, like, look down on the floor and think about a square foot, and imagine that you have to pay $100 a year to lease that space, right? That stuff can get pretty expensive pretty quick, right? So this person, they said, okay, well, with the amount of space and the ovens and the this and the that, it would be like $4,000, $5,000, almost $5,000 a month for rent. And he's like, he didn't even sell one pastry, he didn't even sell one cupcake yet, and he's gonna pay $5,000 a month for rent, right? See, they said you can do that, or I think it was something along the lines of $1,200 for the first 6 months or first year, $1,200 a month plus 10% of your revenues, right? So in some cases, it makes a lot more sense to do that, right? Depending on your particular scenario, it could make a lot more sense to do that. So who has questions about a percentage lease? Now, do you see the 3 different types of leases? Again, like we discussed, gross lease, net lease, and percentage lease. And then we also have a variable lease. Variable lease might be like I talked about. He had kind of like a scenario where, okay, for the first 6 months, it's going to be this rental amount. Then for the next 6 months, it's going to be this rental amount. And for the next year, and for the 3rd year, and for the 4th year. So, they might look at it like, as a specific date, or they might tie it to a specific index, like a consumer price index or some other indicator, and that would be called an index lease. Okay. Now, who knows what's a ground lease, which is our next subject? What's a ground lease?
It's when the owner of a piece of property leases the property to a builder, who will then they will lease another part for the building to be on the ground. Right.
Okay. And so these are long-term types of leases. Now think about it this way. A lot of these big stores, big box stores, maybe a Kohl's, maybe a Target, I don't know exactly. I don't follow them exactly, but I do know that a lot of those types of stores or grocery stores, do they want to own real estate in many cases? The answer is no. Why do they not want to own necessarily real estate?
Insurance.
They might move around a bit.
Well, think about it one way like this. they're not in the business to be a real estate investor. They're in the business to sell groceries, let's just say, right? And that doesn't that tie up some of their money? And at the same time, when we discuss, like, let's say in appraisals, right? Land does not depreciate. You cannot take depreciation for land. And you, right, as a business person might be like, okay, I'm all about accounting and cost accounting and making sure I understand how my business is going to be the most profitable. And it will be the most profitable by having our money fluid, not tying up our money, not having it sit in not having opportunities to use depreciation, right? So what they do in many cases is, yes, they'll find a gentleman, like here's an example. This one particular gentleman, now we know that owning land can be very speculative, right? It can be very risky depending on your scenario. Well, this one gentleman that I know, he owned this land for like 15 years, 20 years, almost 20 years. He's paying taxes on it. No one's building around him, nothing, nobody's doing anything, right? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, what do you think happens? Somebody builds something a half a mile away. Somebody builds something a quarter mile away. Somebody builds something another mile away. And who comes along but a major grocery store? And they say, hey, we want to do a land lease on your land for 50 years, and we will give you $12,000 a month. It's like, hello, did you just win the lotto, right? And that's how that works. So now this grocery store came to him. They built the building on top of his land. They leased it for 50 years, 49 years, whatever the number was, for about $12,000 a month. He doesn't have to do anything but collect the check. That's all he has to do. They take care of the building. They're responsible for maintenance. They're responsible for the taxes on the building, right? They're giving him that money. And basically, they're just paying him rent, right? So you see, in some cases, it does kind of help both parties, right? And so that's what a ground lease is: long enough to make the transaction, the tenant investing in the building, and that's why a lot of times you'll see, like, some restaurant or store or whatever closes up and boom, they're just gone. But the building is still standing there. The owners own the building and they might have never even. Okay. Anybody have questions on ground leases? And there's so many, like if you talk to someone who's really, this is what they do for a living, there's so many different ways that they handle it. We're just talking about the basics, right? Oil and gas lease, right? So first of all, if you live around here, meaning like Connecticut area, I would bet that most towns, they won't even give you the permits or the opportunity to lease out your your ground and what would we call it? Not subterranean. What would it be called? Right. But basically the whole point is that in most towns, you might be like, well, I own this land. And so if I find gold here, I can start mining it and I could lease out the minerals and the oil and the gas for this land and so forth. Right. And I could be a multimillionaire because they can put an oil well over there. Right. Well, most towns that I know of and on the deeds, it says that you can't do mining and you can't put in drills and all that good stuff unless you get a town permit. And I don't know how easy the towns are going to make it around here. Now, if you're out in Texas or something like that, one of these areas where this is what they're used to, it probably would be different, right? But remember, a landowner, if they're able to put an oil or gas lease, right, they can basically lease out the land. And then they might even get a percentage of like a royalty on how much minerals or oil or gas is taken out of the land, which is kind of cool, right? All right. Who knows what's a lease purchase? That's what everybody, well, this is the interesting thing. The people who really don't have the greatest credit or maybe are not making the best amount of money type of thing, they will call me up and they'll be like, hey, Rob, I want to do a rent to own. what do you got for rent to own? And I said, well, why aren't you thinking about buying? Oh, well, my credit's not so great. Or, I didn't do my taxes yet, or whatever it might be. And so on the surface, that sounds like a pretty good idea, right? Well, a lease purchase is basically, remember, you have somebody who owns the property and you're going to them and say, hey, I want to rent it out for 6 months and then I'll buy it, right? Well, the point is you usually have to put down a pretty good amount of money to make someone want to do that, right? And there's a lot of competition with that. So the sellers or the owners of the land, they usually have 25 people who want to do that type of thing. And so if you don't, again, it goes back to, if you don't have good credit, you're probably still not going to be able to do that. And in a lot of cases, which doesn't sound right, and you might be like, oh, I don't know about that one, right? The truth of the matter is that it's almost easier in a lot of cases with the mortgage programs that we have available for you to buy rather than rent. Because the amount of competition for renters and versus the programs that we have available, at least here in central Connecticut, it's almost easier to buy than it is to rent a single, let's just say a single family house, right? But, usually when it comes to a lease purchase, the terms of the sale are going to be negotiated. The closing day is going to be negotiated. A down payment is probably going to be wanted and so forth. And they're going to talk about it. The other reason why I don't love to get involved in this, because I have done it in the past. I have tried to help out people like this and, in this type of scenario. And the worst thing that happens is you think, right, that between you and the other agent, maybe an attorney, maybe the seller, the buyer, that you have all variables covered. And then guess what happens? The roof starts leaking. So the tenant moves in there, everybody's happy, everything's great. Oh yeah, this is gonna be great. And we're gonna have the closing in March and blah, 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 blah. And then the roof starts leaking. And then the roof ruins some of the furniture, right? And maybe ruins the floor and so forth. So now what's the person who's buying the place, which they said, oh yeah, I'm taking care of everything. Don't worry, this is like, it's gonna be my own house. Now what does that person usually say? Oh, the roof leaked and it ruined my TV and my furniture. And so the landlord's got to pay for that. And what does the landlord say?
You agreed to pay.
Your house.
Yeah, well, you said it's going to be your house and you were taking care of everything and I wouldn't have to be responsible for anything. Yeah, but this is not my house yet. I didn't buy it yet. Yeah, but you said you were gonna. And then, here you go. And then who turns out to be the jerk? Because maybe you made like $400 off the deal and you spent like 30 hours.
The realtor.
Yeah.
Hey, have you ever had one actually successfully go
Only like maybe 19 years, like maybe 3 or 4. And I probably made like 2 or 3 enemies, not enemies, but 2 or 3 people that were like not happy. And somehow it's my fault because the hot water heater broke. And now the landlord and the tenant, or the buyer and the seller, are arguing about, well, who's got to pay for it and what about the stuff that was ruined. And I'm like, and that's my fault, So that's why I don't really get involved with it too much anymore, because it doesn't usually turn out to be a happy situation between the parties. It really doesn't.
Horrible.
There's something about karma that for some reason, something is going to happen at that space. And then now the real estate agent's brought in, oh, well, we thought that you said this, or we thought, and you're like, okay, well, here's what it says in the lease. It says, you're going to be responsible for this, this, and this. What do you want me to tell you? I'm not against you, but you said you were going to do everything except for if you're not paying the taxes. Well, I didn't know I was going to pay the water bill. I didn't have to pay water bill at my last rental. Yeah, because you lived in a 3-family house. It says water is checked off here. Yeah, but I didn't know. See, a lot of times too is like I feel, which this is a little bit of a tricky situation because of course we have to say that we are not attorneys, and I always tell people, hey, you can have your attorney look at this if you want to, and then if I still feel like they're not reading it, they're just going through the motions, I'm like, hey, did you read that? Did you see that? And it's almost like I'm having to talk to them about the contract, and it just gets a little bit crazy. And I don't want people to feel like I'm like, you know, somehow so I can make my $400 that I'm like taking advantage of them, because it doesn't work that way. So anyways, long story, that's what a lease purchase is, right? Anyone have any questions on a lease purchase? How about a sale and lease back? What is that? Who would ever do that?
Companies that need a better cash flow.
Right? Or a company that wants to make a huge investment to improve their business, right? You know, so basically what happens? The property owners sell the property and then lease it back. Because again, it might not be in your best interest to actually have $3 million of a property, you know, sitting there where you can't even build enough chairs to sell for your business. Right. So here you are. Let's just make up the story. Your grandfather started a furniture business and he was kicking butt and he bought all kinds of land and the warehouse and all the good stuff. And then who comes along, which I'm sure he's a great guy too, is your father. Right. But your father took over the business from your grandfather. And did he kind of run it the same? Not exactly. He's kind of a party guy. Right. And he wasn't buying all these new equipment and doing all this good stuff. And so now you get involved in the business and you take it over from your father, right? Your father retires, right? He's down in Boca Raton. He's having himself a good time, right? And so you're sitting on this property. It's worth $3 million, but the business is making no money because all the machinery, everything's old, things are broken down. And now you find out, you get yourself pumped up, you go to some convention and you find out, wow, if I make these kinds of new chairs that everybody wants, I can make $1 million a week, right? And you're like, well, how am I going to get the machinery, the equipment in order to make these chairs? Because they need to be made from the special plastic and the computer systems and the this and the that, right? And so you figure out, wow, I can actually find a buyer for my property, give me $3 million for this property. And then I can pay him maybe whatever, $15,000 a month for rent and take the rest of that money and buy all this new equipment. So boom, now I can go and make $1 million a week building all these new chairs. And that's how a lot of times they'll expand, businesses will expand or they'll reinvigorate the business to get it going, right? Make sense? All right. Discharge of a lease. So when we say discharge, we're talking about when the contract is terminated, right? When maybe all the different parties have performed their obligations, right? So remember, if the parties die, does the lease get terminated?
No, unless it's a will.
Okay. So let's think about it this way, which I think is interesting. If it's a residential lease, right? And the landlord dies, the owner, seller, landlord dies, is the lease terminated? Like, it's like, oh my gosh,
No,
I'm living in this 3-family house. I'm living on the 2nd floor. I got an apartment, $800 a month. Now the owner died. I got to move. Is that how it goes? If you have a lease until next July of 2021?
Only if they're on like a month to month or
Right. No, if you have a lease, right, do you automatically, is the lease terminated when the landlord dies?
no,
The answer is no.
no.
But what about if the tenant dies? The
Yeah.
lease, pretty much, unless it says something special in that lease, which I don't know about, pretty much the lease is terminated, which I think is
Yeah.
interesting. How about if it's bankruptcy or foreclosure? Does the lease automatically get terminated?
Yes.
No.
Yeah. right?
Oh,
There's what we call that, what they call that in your yellow book is an operation of law. So if let's just say someone goes to court, the seller goes to court, they get foreclosed on, right? Well, that one is a little bit tricky. That one gets a little bit tricky. If you're up to date on your rent, you cannot.
yeah, because I was in a condo that was foreclosed, but we were still able to stay
Yeah,
with
yeah,
the bank.
that's right. And you have to be able to show that you've been paying your rent.
Yeah.
If bankruptcy, though, the agreement could automatically be terminated, right? If the bank takes over and so forth. But most of the time, if it's residential and you're in some commercial too, you're able to show that you've been paying your rent. A lot of times it doesn't get automatically terminated, right? Usually you can live out the life of the lease. Let's see here. Same thing with it when it's talk about being sold. Usually the new landlord takes over the existing leases, right? That's why we go back to the gentleman that we talked about in last class. That he says, "Hey, I like to do only month to month, because if I wake up tomorrow, I want to sell the property, I'm only on a month to month with everybody." Right? If I wake up, I want to raise the rent, I'm only on a month to month. I give him 30 days notice, I raise the rent. Now, he's not in the business of being self-destructive. He's actually a pretty smart businessman, but that's the story. That's how he, basically he runs his business, which I think is kind of interesting. All right. Eviction. So when it comes to eviction, what's the process? How does it work when it comes to evictions? Right? And so for instance, in Connecticut, what is it that you need to do in order to handle your evictions? Like, so let's say you own a property, a 3-family property, and now you are not, the tenant's not paying their rent and you're not standing for it anymore. So what is it that you need to do, the first step?
And then notice to quit.
Okay,
Serve a notice.
notice to quit.
Notice to quit.
Now, here's the tricky part of things. If you are a corporation, can you do it yourself?
A lawyer.
A lawyer, you have to get a lawyer to do it, right? If you own the property yourself, like a self-proprietor type of thing, then you don't have to get an attorney. So that's where things get a little bit tricky. So since we're getting more into the basics of Connecticut, let's, I'm going to kind of switch over and we're going to look at the Unit 12 in the state of Connecticut practice of law. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, because I think we've pretty much exhausted the yellow book. Okay.
So we're going over to the red book right now, Unit 12.
You got it, my friend. So, but we're not going to spend a lot of time. We're going to go over some of the basics and see what we really need to know. So just like with everything else, we talked about this in previous classes. What does it mean when we talk about the statute of frauds? What is the statute of frauds?
It has to be in writing.
It has to be in writing to be enforceable in court. So again, in Connecticut, the statute of frauds basically says that all contracts for greater than $500 must be in writing, and leases are considered contracts, right? And this is even if it's a month to month, week to week, whatever it is. Now, again, do you ever have to record leases in the town records? Is there ever time where like example, I have this person that they want to lease out this apartment right here in East Hartford for $2,000 a month. So the person that my client, my tenant said, well, ask them if they'll do 1,800 because I'm not so sure. 2,000 is a little expensive. So the person came back to me this morning and said, hey, if it's a multi-year lease, we will do, we'll come down a little bit. Okay. So since now, if it's multi-year, let's say we sign it for 2 or 3 years, technically by law, what's supposed to happen? By Connecticut law,
It has to be recorded in the records.
Yeah, it has to be recorded in the town records to give constructive notice to a third party, so that if somebody was possibly going to buy it, right, they would know that there's already a long-term in place. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Okay,
But only if it's over 1 year.
that's right. Leases for a term of more than 1 year are to be recorded in the local land records. Okay, something we're not necessarily used to, but I think it's kind of interesting, right? And it is the Connecticut state law. Let's see here. There's certain clauses that are not supposed to be in leases. Like example, a person agreeing to waive his or her legal rights under the Connecticut general statutes, allowing the landlord to automatically obtain a judgment in court without the tenant's knowledge, right? That's not acceptable to put that in the lease. Excusing the landlord from any damages that the tenant suffers that would normally be the responsibilities of the landlord. Agreeing to waive his or her right to interest on the security deposit, right? So it can't be in the lease that you're automatically agreeing to like let that go, because again, it is a security deposit. Agreeing to allow the landlord to evict or dispose him or her without court order. So we know in Connecticut, you have to bring them to court, right? Consent to the seizure of property as security for rent, right? Agreeing to pay the landlord's attorney's fees in excess of 15% of any judgment. So there's certain clauses that are in a lease, and even if you put those in the lease, they're not going to be enforceable. And a judge or magistrate or whatever the housing court you would want to call that person, even a housing specialist, they're going to look at that's being, a little bit, I guess, egregious. It's not going to be something that they're going to look upon that's acceptable. All right. So, what's the most you could charge in the state of Connecticut for security deposit? What's the most you could
2
demand?
months.
2 months,
And then how about if they're 62 years or older?
1.
1 month, right? And where are security deposits supposed to be kept?
In a separate account.
Escrow account.
Escrow account.
That's right, separate account. And when is the landlord supposed to pay the interest to the tenant?
When the tenant,
When they move out.
30 days, I thought.
30 days after they move out.
Okay?
Yearly.
Year on the anniversary,
Yearly.
First read.
Mhm.
right? On the anniversary of the lease, right? And the penalty for not doing so is a fine of how much money?
500.
$100. $100 if you do not pay the interest on the lease, right? Now, when we talk about the security deposit or interest on the security deposit, when we talk about the security deposit as far as giving it back, right? You are supposed to give it back within how many days?
30 days.
30.
Right. Within 30 days, you're supposed to either one, give it back, or give them a written notification of the nature of the damages and so forth, and then figure out what's the balance. Does that make sense? All right. What else do you need to know? You need to know when can a landlord, how long do they have to give notice for the right to enter the dwelling?
24 hours?
Okay, like
Reasonable advance
It depends
notice.
if it's an emergency or not.
right? So what if it's not emergency?
The law you give notice is no time, right?
It would be agreed upon in the contract.
Notice, reasonable notice that does not constitute harassment of the tenant. So is that 24 hours? Is it 18 hours? Is it 72 hours? The whole point has to
There's
be,
no,
okay?
Mhm.
And so that's kind of, there's no exact amount of time, right? Let's see here. So remember landlord's obligations, right? They have to make sure when we're talking mostly about residential, that of course, everything applies, the building and housing codes, fit in habitable condition, right? Keeping all common areas in clean and safe condition, providing and maintaining trash receptacles. Now, even if the tenant is paying for heat and hot water, right? What do you have to do as the landlord concerning the heat and hot water?
Making sure that they can and that all the equipment is workable so they can get hot heat and hot water.
That's right. You have to make sure that it's being supplied, right? So you can't say, well, it's not my fault the furnace is broken, you're paying for heat and hot water. You have to fix, as the landlord, you have to make sure that that stuff is working, that the heat, the hot water, the cold water is being supplied to them, even if the tenant's paying for it. Interesting situation. Can you demand the tenant pays for cold water in the lease?
Mm-mm.
What do you think?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you repeat it?
Can you demand that in the lease that the tenant pays for cold water?
Yes, we do.
Sure, you can demand anything if they agree to it.
Well, by law, when
Oh.
can you do that? By law, when can you do that? So if you have a 3-family house and it's only one water meter, can you do it?
No.
No. What if you have a 3-unit commercial property? So 3-unit residential, one water meter is a no.
Which is a ghost lease.
Okay, is a no, you can't do that. But 3-unit commercial property, can you say, okay, well, you are a hair salon, so you're gonna pay 45% of the water bill, and you are a vape store, so you're gonna pay 25% of the water bill, and then what's left, 35%, you're a barber shop, you're gonna pay 35%. Can you do that for commercial?
Yes.
Yeah. See, so remember, for residential, it goes by water meter. You can't do it unless they have their own separate water meter. And we're not even talking about sub meters. These are meters that are supposed to be like approved by the water company. So that's why if you're renting out a single family home, yes, you can tell them, hey, or even let's say if it's a condo where each person has their own water meter, you can tell them, yeah, you have to pay for your own cold water, right? But if it's like a multi-family property where you don't have separate approved by the water company meters, you can't do it. But for commercial, you can. So it gets a little bit tricky there. Anyone have any questions on that stuff? All right. Let's see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If there's 2 meters, but the water is under the owner's.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting you. Say again?
Oh, hold on.
Is there another computer next to you or something?
I think it might be because other people have their mics on.
Usually,
Now?
it's only if it's in the same household or close by.
Okay, if there's 2 meters and both are in the owner's name.
Right? So, well, remember, here's what's interesting in most towns in Connecticut, right? They will only switch the name on the water bill as to who owns the property in most towns. So even if it's a 2-family house, let's say a duplex, right? 2 families, duplex, and both of the water meters are going to be in the owner's name. But you could put in the lease, hey, here you have to be responsible for your cold water, and here's the meter number. And so once a month, I'm going to give you the water bill and you have to pay it because that's what it's coming from your meter from the water company. So yes, you can do that. But there are some 2-family houses that they only have one water meter. If they only have one water meter, no, you can't do that. You can't say, oh, each of you is paying 50-50 because that's just considered to be not acceptable for the state of Connecticut. Make sense? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody
Yes.
if somebody pays rent in cash, you have to give them a receipt, even if they don't request it. Okay, you have to make sure you do that. What are the tenant obligations? Complying with all building, housing, and fire codes, keeping his or her unit safe and clean, removing trash and rubbish, keeping plumbing fixtures and appliances clean, not willingly destroy, damage, or impair any property. So as an example, when I first started in real estate, people were like really trashing apartments, and there was absolutely nothing you could do but bring them to the housing court. I don't remember the exact year. I'm going to guesstimate 2001 or 2003, something along those lines, that they actually made it a either a felony or misdemeanor. So a tenant who intentionally damages leased property is considered to have committed a crime and can be criminally prosecuted. They can be now arrested, right? If the property damage exceeds $1,500, it could be considered a Class D felony. If it's between $250 but less than $1,500, it could be considered a misdemeanor, right? So in some cases, if they are really trashing the place, especially even reckless action, you can have them arrested, right? But thank God you usually don't have to do that very often. I mean, you know, and a lot of it's going to depend on the way you pick the tenants and how you handle the tenants, how you work with them, how you talk with them, because everybody wants to be talked to nice. Everybody wants to be talked to respectfully, right? And there's no reason that you have to get too crazy. Once in a while, we might, you know, we're not all perfect. We might lose our temper just a little bit, but you got to hold back, right? Landlord's recourse. So remember, if a tenant fails to pay rent within 9 days of the due date. So does the due date always have to be the first? No. You can have it whatever day you want to, but usually, so that you don't make things too tricky and complicated, it's usually best to say, okay, the rent is due on the first of the month and you have to pay, the money has to be in my hands by the 10th, right? Otherwise, what can the landlord do? Terminate the lease and start the eviction process, okay? And so, you know, usually, like we have talked about a little bit, if they haven't paid their rent, non-payment of rent, that's usually the most typical one. But if the tenant is using the unit in an illegal manner, like maybe drug factory type of thing, or they're moving in guests or family members without the landlord's consent, right? There could be an issue, right? But remember, you have to be really careful whether you're a landlord or a tenant, that you're not doing things retaliatory, because when the housing court starts seeing those types of things, you, especially as the landlord, are going to end up losing. So you can't say, well, you know, I'm mad at you about this, or because you did this, I'm raising the rent, retaliatory. So again, landlords cannot raise rent as retaliatory action within 6 months after the tenant made a good faith attempt to legally remedy a violation. So like, let's say for instance, you as the landlord, they told you the heat wasn't working and it's a cold day and you took, you know, a week to get the heat fixed. Like, you know, there's nothing special going on. You could have got a plumber over there right away, but you didn't want to spend that extra money, right? So now the tenant calls the town on you, which, hey, they should have a right to do that, because, you know, it's one thing if it's 1 or 2 days because of an emergency where the boiler blew up, right? And it's going to take a few days. But it's another thing when they're calling you, texting you, emailing you, and you're not getting back to them, and you just are waiting for your friend to come back from Florida who's the plumber. That's not acceptable, right? And so they go to the town, they go to the housing court, and now the landlord comes back and says, well, because you did that, I'm going to raise the rent. See, that's when the landlord's going to get in trouble, right? You cannot take retaliatory action, right? You know, so that's pretty important. How about if the tenant abandons the property? So let's talk about a tenant abandoning a property. So let's say the tenant you have a lease with the tenant until, what's it now, October. So let's say there's another 6 months on the lease. So that's until April. So here you are, you're thinking that they're going to stay until April 30th, right? Now all of a sudden, you see that they didn't pay October's rent. You go over to the property and you kind of look around, you don't see their car. You ask one of the neighbors, hey, have you seen Jerry around? She's like, oh, Jerry, he left last month. I guess he got into a fight with his girlfriend. He said he was moving to California. Right? And now you're like, well, he has that lease with me until April 30th, right? So what, as the landlord, are you required to do?
I think you have to try to reach out, right, for a certain amount of time.
Try to rent the property again.
Right.
Now,
Start a practical vision.
Reasonable effort to rent it.
that's right. Now, can you just sit back and say, well, you know what? I'm bringing him to court, and I'm just going to keep this rental vacant, right? And bring him to court for up until April 30th that he owes me that money.
No.
Can you do that? No.
No.
You have to actually make all reasonable efforts to re-rent the property, right? And then you can, once you re-rent it, let's say you lost 2 months rent, let's say it takes you till December 1st to rent it out now, right? So you lost October, you lost November, you lost 2 months rent. Yes, you can bring him to court. You could bring Jerry to court for those 2 months, but you can't just like sit on it and expect that now he just owes you up until April. Okay, so that's important to know on how to deal with a tenant abandonment. Now, remember, there's a lot of times where the tenant also has recourse, right? Tenant also has remedies. If the landlord breaches the rental agreement, the tenant can terminate the agreement. So again, here we are, the tenant's not getting any heat, 1, maybe 2 weeks. What can the tenant do? The tenant can say, okay, I'm giving you notice, and they must give the landlord 15 days from the receipt of the written notice that provoked the breach, and basically say that they are terminating the lease. I'm not staying here until next April because I noticed, that it took you, it's taken you 12 days to fix this heat and it's still not working, and I've been freezing every day. So I'm breaking the lease, right? But I can tell you one of the most important things to do, and some tenants don't necessarily do this, and that's where it turns into issues, is that the tenant should still pay the rent. But who should they pay the rent to? Anybody know? The housing court, right? So if you're a tenant and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy, he's not fixing this heat, we'll just stay on this whole heat thing. He's not fixing the heat, and I shouldn't have to pay rent when I don't even have heat, right? Well, if you want to do the right thing as the tenant so that you don't have a problem and it doesn't have an issue with your eviction history and so forth, you still pay the rent, but you pay the rent to the housing court. You make and then you pay the rent to the housing court. And then when the housing court reconciles everything and gets everybody together and figures it all out, then they're going to figure out if the landlord is due any of that rent, and and then give you maybe back some of that rent and all that kind of good stuff. But if you just automatically stop paying your rent, see, that's when everything starts getting cloudy. Well, I didn't pay my rent because he didn't fix this. And then the landlord's like, that's not true. The heat didn't break until the 8th and the rent was due on the 1st, and we never had a problem before. And that's when everything becomes an issue. And the worst thing as a tenant, I can tell you, is to get a record of having housing violations or housing problems, because it's just not going to be looked at as very favorable when you go get another rental. Okay. How about if the tenant, how about if the property is damaged or destroyed, right? What should the tenant do? Should the tenant still pay the rent?
No, they're not liable to pay the rent.
So they're not liable to pay the rent. And at the option of the tenant, he or she may vacate the premises and notify the landlord of intention to terminate the lease agreement within 15 days and so forth. So does that make sense? All right. So let's talk about this whole thing about the summary process or the eviction process. So again, like many of you said, when it comes to residential, the first step is to do a notice to quit, right? And so again, you have to have a valid reason. Usually, again, it's for non-payment of rent, but you can have it for other things. It's just going to be maybe a little bit harder in court to actually enforce it, right? And, you know, so that's the first step as the landlord, is to serve a notice to quit. And you're going to basically ask them to move. Now, if they don't, what's the next step?
Court action.
Court action. You file a complaint in the Superior Court. If the tenant fails to appear in the court, they're going to file a judgment and award the landlord possession. If the tenant appears in court, then they're probably going to have a hearing. You know, what I usually see, or at least before COVID, now we don't see anything and everything's a little crazy. They might have even opened up, I don't know yet. Or maybe they're going to do it. I know they delayed it. So they were going to do it in October, but I think they delayed it again. Anyways, the whole point is usually they get the parties together with a housing specialist, right? And that usually takes about 3 weeks. And if the two parties can agree on things, great. If not, then either party, they'll have an option to go to the hearing. And then, you know, it's usually going to be pro tenant on the hearing. I could tell you that right from the start. That's how it goes, right? So remember, the court at least around here in Connecticut, the court requires that tenants making appeals in an eviction action has to post a bond for all rents accrued and those that will become due during the appeal, right? And so that's important. There could be a stay of execution, right? Where the court might give them, you know, more time or more days to be able to stay at the property. There could be an eviction and removal of the tenant. Most tenants who don't pay, they go from landlord to landlord to landlord. And that's why, you know, we talked a little bit about this in the last class, and I know it makes me sound like I'm the bad guy, but I try to stop that, right? You're not gonna pay, you're not gonna pay me rent. I'm gonna make sure that I do what I need to do to make you understand that it's important to pay your rent. If you're getting a good property, why should you not pay your rent? That you're just going to take off on me. Now you owe me 3 months of rent and you're going to hurt the next person, right? And so that's what a lot of tenants do. They just, you know, well, not a lot of tenants. That's what some tenants do. And it is the small percentage, because there's a lot of good people out there who just want a nice place to live, and they're going to work every day and they're paying their rent. But there are those small percentage of people that are disrespectful to themselves, disrespectful to the properties, and really just don't care. So anyways, if that happens where there is considered to be the court says, okay, the tenant has to move, and they don't move, right? Then the state marshal will be on point to be able to actually eject them, right? And then they might even have personal items in the property, right? And so what has to happen with that? Does the landlord just get to throw out all their personal items?
Yeah.
Right. Well, basically,
Within 10 days.
the landlord has to put the stuff in storage usually, right? And they have to claim it. They usually have a period of 15
10
days.
days? Oh, 15.
15 days. Oh, well, it could be possibility of a sale of the belongings if they are not claimed within 10 days. Yes, you're right about that.
Okay.
If the tenant does not claim the goods removed from the property immediately, they will be removed and stored for 15 days, right? And then usually there might be a sale. Once the sale has occurred, the tenant may claim the proceeds, less expenses within 30 days. Thank God, out of all the apartments that I've owned in all these years, I never had to go that far with it because that's like a whole nother level of stuff. Usually what we would do is if they leave stuff in the apartment, we have the nice plastic bags, the Glad, right? Make you feel happy. Put them in the Glad bag. Put them in the basement we would usually put them in there for 60 days. And then once, if nobody comes for them, we throw them out, right? So that's basically how we would do it. Somebody might tell you that's not right, that's not correct. but we won't just throw them out right away, right? There might be, depending on the situation, for elderly or physically disabled people, right? It might be very, very difficult because they are considered to be a protected class to evict them, except for maybe non-payment of rent or non-compliance and so forth. But it could be very, very difficult. So that's something to know. So forth. So who has any questions about the basic, discussion of the eviction process? Anyone have any stories or anything they want to share? I know we went over a lot of stories last class. That's what it really is. And, they talk about here in your book about the Fair Rent Commission, where renter occupied dwellings exceed 5,000 units are required to have a fair rent commission unless a municipality voted against it. I don't even know if we have any of those in Connecticut. I'm not so sure that we do. And there are some towns where they have an absentee landlord database. So there are some towns where you might have to make sure that you register as an absentee landlord and that they know how to get a hold of you if there was a problem, right? And then your book gives you a basic residential lease, right? So who has any questions about leases? Anyone? All right. Going once, going twice, 3 times. Okay, so now what you need to do is take a pencil and a piece of paper out so we can get ready for our quiz. All right, let's see how we do. So, number 1, a tenant pays for his own utilities and makes one payment each month to the landlord, who pays the taxes, insurance on the building, and maintenance. What type of lease arrangement is this?
Gross.
B. Gross.
You got it. Gross. Number 2, some tenants want to.
I can't. Is it B? I can't see the number 1.
It's B.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. I got it. Thank you.
All right. Number 2, some tenants want to buy the house they are renting. However, they do not have enough money for the down payment. The landlord agreed to put part of the tenant's rent toward the purchase price. The landlord and tenants have agreed to what?
A.
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 You got it. A lease purchase. Number 3, the expiration date of a 1-year lease is September 30th. On July 1st, the house is sold to a family that wants to live in the rental property. Assuming the lease not
Sorry.
clause, how soon can they move in? What do you?
Yours is on, right?
Yeah, mine is.
D.
Is everything all right? What's going on there, guys? Everybody all right? So what do you like for number 3?
C.
D.
C.
C.
B.
B.
Okay. So you see the expiration date is September 30th, right? The lease stays in place. So what's the day after October 30th they can move in?
October 1st. Yep.
All right, so number 3 is using Charlie. Number 4.
Is
Somebody
anybody
needs
else
to mute
getting
their
terrible
phone.
feedback? I
They
can't
need to
hear.
mute. Yeah,
Oh,
'cause I can't hear anything.
Mute everybody.
Some of y'all need to be muted.
Hold on, my friends. Let's see here. What do I gotta do? I gotta go here. I gotta mute all. And then when you want to say your answer, you hold down the space bar. Number 4, a woman rents an apartment from a man under a 1-year written lease. The expiration date of the lease is May 1st. How much notice must the man give the woman to recover possession when the lease expires?
D. None.
D.
E.
E.
Got it. None. Right? Because why?
It was a 1-year written lease, so that makes it a year to year, which makes it end as soon as that happens. They don't have to give notice.
That's right. And it's called an estate for years. All right. So remember, you don't have to give notice for an estate for years. Number 5, 2 years ago, a woman rented a parcel of property to a man. The agreement stated only that the man agreed to pay the woman 500 shkamolis per month. What type of tenancy does the man have?
D, periodic.
Periodic.
D.
You got it. D, periodic. Number 6, a man rents an apartment under a 2-year written lease from a landlord. 3 months after signing the lease, the man is transferred to another country for a year. During this period, he leases the apartments to a woman. The woman mails monthly rent checks to the man, who continues to make monthly rental payments to the landlord. In this situation, the woman has a what?
Sublease.
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 C.
Lease. And who, right? So remember, they didn't give up all the rights, because if they gave up all the rights, that would be an assignment, but this is a sublease.
Mhm.
Okay. Number 7, a tenant lives in an apartment building owned by a landlord. Vandals break into the building and destroy the central air conditioning system. The tenant's apartment becomes uncomfortably warm. The next day, the tenant sues the landlord for constructive eviction. In this situation, will the tenant win?
D.
No. D.
I got D as in David.
I did
Yes,
C.
David, yeah.
Right?
D.
The premises are not usable. The condition was not due to the landlord's conscious neglect, and the tenant has not abandoned the property. So the tenant's probably not going to win that one. All right. In August, a tenant signs a 1-year lease in an apartment complex. Rent payments are due on the 15th of each month. On December 12th, the apartment complex is sold to a new owner. On March 14th, the building burns down. Which of these statements accurately describes the tenant's obligations?
A.
A.
You got it. A, the tenant is not required to continue paying after March 14th because the premises have been destroyed. All right, number 9, a woman signs a lease to rent an apartment. Her lease runs from October 1st until November 1st of the following year. A man signs a 2-year lease to rent an apartment in a new building that will be ready for occupancy in 15 months. Which of these leases must be in writing to satisfy the statute of frauds?
C.
C.
They're both C, and why?
So they greater than a year.
Right, exactly, because they're both more than 1 year. All right. Number 10, a tenant asked a 1-year lease with a landlord on April 10th, or signed a 1-year lease. On the following March 1st, the landlord asked the tenant whether the lease would be renewed, not on. The tenant did not respond, but was still in the apartment on April 11th. Little holdover there. What can the landlord do?
D as in David.
D.
D, right? So basically they can either evict a holdover tenant or accept a rent check, creating a holdover or periodic tenancy, right? And so the original lease was what?
A 1-year lease.
Which is what kind of lease? Estate for years.
Right.
And then it became a what?
A period.
Period.
Yeah.
Well, because it's holdover, it would be what? If they pay the rent, it would be periodic, but basically because they did not pay, if they did not pay it, it would become a what? Sufferance, tenant at sufferance.
Sufferance.
So you got to remember that one, because you never know when that's going to come up. All right.
Okay.
Number 11, if a tenant remains in possession of leased property after the expiration of the lease term without paying rent and without the landlord's consent, what is the tenant's status?
B.
B.
D.
The good old
D.
trespasser. Yep.
Trespasser. Trespasser.
Trespass.
Estaba traspasando, alguien quería
12, a woman wanted to rent an apartment from a man. Because of a physical disability, it would be necessary for the woman to have all the doorknobs replaced with lever type handles. In this case, which of these statements is true?
A.
A.
B.
Okay. So does the landlord have to do it? No.
Oh. Yeah, it was either A or B. That's what I was
But
thinking.
the landlord or the man is obligated to permit,
Oh.
to allow the modifications. So they have to allow it, but they don't have to do it.
But they don't have to pay for it. Oh, okay.
That's right. 13, a man operates a small store in a shopping center. Under the terms of the lease, the landlord pays all operating expenses. The man pays a base rent of $1,000 per month plus 15% of monthly gross profits over $10,000. So taking part of the profits, what is that?
I put
B.
D.
B is in boy.
B.
Remember, 15% of monthly gross profits. So that's
I did D because it said the profits over 10, so I thought it would be variable because
yeah,
of the-
I know. But the main part about it is that it, remember, variable is usually tied to either time or an index.
Okay.
14, when a landowner leases unimproved land to a tenant, who agrees to erect a building on the land? The lease is usually
C.
what?
C. Ground.
C.
As in boy.
C.
Ground lease.
No, C.
Number 15, a man rented a house from a landlord. During
This is
the
a horrible question.
D.
Could be C.
E is what
D
I
as in
put.
David.
D.
I had to do a mute all, sorry, it was getting loud. So I don't know.
C.
C, right? The man who failed to make the rent in this situation, it would be C. The man is still liable to the landlord for the outstanding rent because the landlord did not release the man. Number 16, a security deposit held by a landlord. What does it do?
C.
A.
C.
A.
A, compensates the landlord in the event of rent default or premises damage. All right. Number 17, who owns the building that is erected on land that has a ground lease?
C.
C. C is on Charlie.
C.
You got it, the lessee. So remember, usually it's separate ownership of the land and the buildings. Number 18, what must the landlord do before commencing a lawsuit for actual eviction?
Notice.
Notice the quick.
D.
Serve a
Sir.
notice on the tenant, right? Notice to quit. Number 19, a landlord comes to a tenant's apartment on a daily basis to make sure everything is okay or to make repairs. The apartment, however, is not in need of any repairs. The landlord generally lets himself into the apartment with his spare key. Which of these is true?
C.
C is on Charlie.
C.
C, the landlord is violating the covenant quiet enjoyment and is probably some kind of psycho. So be careful. And then number 20, a lease that provides for specified rent increases at set future dates is called a what?
A.
B is in boy.
B.
As in boy.
Oh.
You got it, my friend.
B.
B as in boy.
Boy. All right. So with that in mind, just remember that let's see here. Where am I? So just remember that what we're basically talking about is 5 points each. So how do you think you all did?
I did great.
I did well.
Not bad.
90%.
All right. And so remember, it's important to make sure that you're studying this unit every single step of the way. All right.
Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome. So let's
Thank
Where are we going next?
gonna do
So the sound gonna be open book.